He was a mess attendant with zero gunnery training. When the attack began, he grabbed a 50 cal and shot down 4 planes. The Navy waited 6 months to tell his story. The morning of December 7, 1941, began like any other Sunday in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The sky was pale blue, the sea calm, and the air carried that lazy peace that comes before something world-changing. Sailors were waking slowly, some writing letters home, others heading for breakfast in the galley. Among them was a 22-year-old black sailor from Waco, Texas, Doris Miller, mess attendant 3rd class aboard the battleship USS West Virginia. To most of the Navy, he was just the cook. He served food, cleared tables, washed dishes, and helped keep the ship's crew fed. The Navy didn't allow African-American sailors to hold combat positions back then. They could only serve as cooks, stewards, or cleaners. But Dory didn't complain. He worked hard, carried himself with quiet pride, and took his duties seriously. He had grown up in the segregated South, the son of sharecroppers, strong from working the fields before dawn. He played football in high school and towered over most men, with broad shoulders and powerful arms. That strength would soon make history. As the West Virginia floated at Battleship Row that morning, Dory was below deck in the laundry room, sorting clothes. The world above him was still peaceful, until it wasn't. At 7:55 a.m., the first Japanese aircraft roared out of the clouds. A scream of engines, the sudden whistle of falling bombs, and then the thunder. Explosions tore through the air, ripping into steel hulls, fireballs erupting across the harbor. The attack on Pearl Harbor had begun. The West Virginia shuddered violently. Dory dropped what he was holding and looked up. Within seconds, alarms blared. "General quarters! All hands to battle stations!" The calm morning had turned into a nightmare. He sprinted toward his assigned post, the ammunition magazine, but found it already wrecked by the first torpedoes. Smoke filled the corridors. The ship listed heavily to port. Fires were spreading fast. Somewhere above, men were screaming for help. Then an officer called out, "Get to the deck! We need every hand up there!" Dory didn't hesitate. He raced upward, his 200-pound frame carrying him through the chaos, through thick black smoke, toward the sound of the guns. When he reached the deck, what he saw was hell. Japanese planes swarmed like hornets, strafing everything in sight. The West Virginia had already taken several hits. The battleship Arizona, anchored nearby, exploded in a blinding flash, a fireball so massive it lifted her out of the water. Flames, twisted metal, and the smell of oil filled the air. But in the middle of it all, sailors were fighting back, manning anti-aircraft guns, hauling ammunition, dragging the wounded to safety. Lieutenant Commander Dory C. Johnson, the ship's executive officer, lay wounded on the deck. Dory and another sailor dragged him to a safer position behind the conning tower. Blood pooled under the man, but there was no time to stop. Another officer, seeing Dory's size and strength, shouted, "You, help me load that gun." Dory turned toward a twin-mounted Browning 50 caliber machine gun, one of the ship's anti-aircraft defenses. The sailor who had manned it was dead. Dory had never even touched one before. "I didn't know how to operate it," he would later say, "but it wasn't hard. I just pulled the trigger and she worked fine." He climbed behind the gun, planted his feet, and started firing. The vibration shook through his body as he squeezed the trigger. The sound was deafening, the deep, angry roar of a weapon meant for war. Tracers streaked across the sky, cutting through the smoke. One plane dove straight toward him. He tracked it, held his breath, fired, and hit. The Japanese bomber burst into flames and spiraled down into the harbor. Another came next, and another. Dory kept firing, unflinching. The air was alive with bullets and death. Shell casings rained around his boots. The gun grew red-hot from constant fire, but he refused to stop. The world had turned upside down. A cook was now defending one of America's greatest battleships. Eyewitnesses later swore he shot down at least 3, maybe 4 enemy aircraft before his ammunition ran out. Even after that, he stayed on deck, helping move the wounded to safety, carrying men twice his size through oil-slicked water. He refused to abandon ship until ordered to. When the attack finally ended, more than 2,400 Americans were dead. The West Virginia was sinking, her decks aflame, her hull full of holes. The United States had just been dragged into World War II. In the chaos that followed, the Navy began to gather reports of heroism, but Doris Miller's name wasn't mentioned. The story spread quietly among sailors. The big black mess attendant who grabbed a machine gun and fought back. Word reached officers, then reporters, but officially, there was silence. It wasn't until months later that the Navy confirmed the story, after public pressure and news leaks forced them to acknowledge what had happened. The image of the black cook who fought back at Pearl Harbor began appearing in newspapers across the country. For Black Americans, it was a moment of pride and defiance. In an era when segregation was law and African Americans were denied most rights, Doris Miller became a symbol, proof that courage knew no color. But recognition came slowly. In May 1942, 6 months after the attack, Doris was finally awarded the Navy Cross, the second highest honor for valor in combat. At the ceremony aboard the aircraft carrier Enterprise, Admiral Chester Nimitz himself pinned the medal on Doris' chest. Nimitz said, "This marks the first time in this conflict that such high tribute has come to a member of his race. I'm proud to commend the bravery of one who has done so much with so little training." Photographs of that moment spread nationwide. Doris standing tall, in his crisp navy whites, eyes steady but humble. He looked like a man who still couldn't quite believe the attention. When reporters asked how he felt, he simply said, "I just did what I thought was best," when the time came. But beneath the surface, the story was more complex. The Navy praised him publicly, but kept him confined to the same low-ranking service role. Despite his heroism, he was still not allowed to train as a gunner or hold combat status. Still, his name traveled far beyond the Navy. Across America, especially in Black communities, Doris Miller became a legend. Churches told his story in sermons. Civil rights groups used his image in rallies. Posters appeared reading, "Remember Pearl Harbor, remember Doris Miller." He represented something America hadn't yet faced, the contradiction between its ideals and its realities. A man willing to die for a country that still treated him as less than equal. Back in Waco, his family followed the news with tears and pride. His mother, Henrietta Miller, told reporters she wasn't surprised. "He's always been brave," she said softly, "even as a boy." Yet for Doris himself, the attention was strange. He returned to duty quietly, serving aboard the USS Indianapolis, then later on the escort carrier Liscombe Bay. Wherever he went, sailors recognized him. Some saluted him out of respect, others whispered or looked away. The world was changing, slowly. Black Americans were pushing for a double V, victory against fascism abroad and racism at home. Doris had become a living example of both fights. But he never acted like a celebrity. He sent most of his pay home to help his parents. He wrote short letters, saying little about himself. Once he told a reporter, "I'm just staying in until the war's over. Then I'm going home." He didn't know that his journey was only half told, and that his story, though celebrated, was far from over. Because fate, once again, wasn't done with Doris Miller. The Pacific War moved fast after Pearl Harbor. In the months that followed, America's anger turned into steel and fire. Shipyards along the West Coast worked day and night, cranking out new destroyers, aircraft carriers, and bombers. Men who had never held a rifle before were training to fight across oceans. Women were building planes in factories. Every corner of the country buzzed with one purpose: revenge and victory. But amid that massive war machine, there was still one name that echoed quietly, almost like a legend passed from man to man: Doris Miller. He'd gone from being an anonymous sailor to one of the most famous enlisted men in the Navy. His photo had appeared in newspapers from California to New York. Hollywood had even started making films that hinted at his story: brave men standing behind machine guns as bombs rained down. But the real man, the one behind the myth, was still out at sea, doing his job. When he reported for his next assignment, the USS Indianapolis, some of the crew didn't believe the tall, calm sailor carrying trays in the galley was the Doris Miller. He didn't talk much about Pearl Harbor unless someone asked directly. Even then, he downplayed it. "I just did what anybody would do," he'd say. But everybody knew that wasn't true. Most people would have frozen. He didn't. Still, life aboard the ship wasn't easy. The Navy was slowly changing, but not enough. Black sailors were still limited to service roles, no matter their experience or medals. There were whispers of resentment from some white crewmen who didn't like the idea of a black man wearing the Navy Cross. Others, though, saw him as a hero, no matter his color. One petty officer later said, "When you worked with Doris, you forgot about all that race stuff. He was a sailor first. He earned that respect." As the war spread across the Pacific, the U.S. Navy fought fierce battles: Coral Sea, Midway, Guadalcanal. Doris' name came up in recruiting drives and war bond posters. The Navy used his face to encourage more African Americans to enlist, even as it kept them confined to the same roles. It was a contradiction he probably felt deeply, though he never said much about it. In early 1943, Doris was transferred again, this time to the escort carrier USS Liscum Bay. It was a smaller, newer ship, part of the massive fleet supporting the Gilbert Islands campaign. By now, the U.S. had the momentum. American forces were retaking islands one by one, pushing back the Japanese Empire mile by mile. Spirits were high. Doris liked his new assignment. He wrote home that he was doing fine and that the food was better than on his last ship. He sent part of his paycheck to his parents in Waco, who proudly showed his letters to neighbors. His story had made him a hometown hero, but to them, he was still just Doris, the boy who used to milk cows before sunrise. By November 1943, Liscum Bay had joined Task Force 52, stationed near Macon Island. The battle had gone well. American forces had secured the island, and morale aboard ship was good. Thanksgiving had just passed. The sea was calm. Then came November 24th. At dawn, the carrier was sailing near Butaritari Atoll. The sun hadn't yet risen. Most of the crew were either asleep or just waking up. Doris was likely in the galley, preparing for breakfast, when it happened. A Japanese submarine, I-175, lurking in the darkness, fired a spread of torpedoes. One of them struck the Liscum Bay, straight into her bomb magazine. The explosion was instant, catastrophic. Witnesses said it was like the entire ship jumped out of the ocean. Flames burst hundreds of feet into the air. The carrier's stern was obliterated. Men were thrown overboard, engulfed in fire and oil. Within 23 minutes, the Liscum Bay was gone, swallowed by the sea. Out of 916 men aboard, only 272 survived. Doris Miller was not among them. He was 24 years old. News of the sinking took weeks to reach the mainland. His family was notified quietly through a telegram. At first, they hoped it was a mistake. But as survivor lists came out, the truth settled in. The Navy officially listed him as missing in action, then later presumed dead. America mourned him. Newspapers that had once printed his photo with headlines of bravery now carried stories of his death. The Pittsburgh Courier wrote, "Doris Miller died as he lived, at his post." But even in death, his legacy didn't fade. It grew. To Black Americans, Dory's story wasn't just about one man's courage, it was a mirror of their struggle. The United States had entered the war talking about freedom and democracy, but millions of its own citizens were still second class. Yet here was a man, denied training, denied equality, who had defended that very idea of freedom with his bare hands. Civil rights leaders began invoking his name in speeches. "If Doris Miller can die for America," one preacher thundered in Alabama, "then America can live up to what it promises." In 1944, schools and community centers across the country began naming themselves after him. Miller Recreation Center, Dory Miller School, Dory Miller Hall. His face appeared on war posters beside slogans like, "For Democracy, Fight Like Dory." Even Hollywood began to take notice. Though no film named him directly, characters inspired by him appeared in patriotic war movies. Brave, humble sailors who rose to heroism when chaos struck. Still, there was unfinished business. For years, veterans and civil rights advocates argued that Dory deserved the Medal of Honor, not just the Navy Cross. They wrote letters, gathered petitions, and lobbied Congress. But the Navy resisted. The official line was that his actions, while heroic, didn't meet the criteria. Unofficially, many suspected the reason was simpler. He was Black. Back home in Waco, his parents quietly endured the attention. They didn't speak bitterly. When asked about the Medal of Honor controversy, his mother just said, "My son did his duty. That's all a man can do." But history has a way of remembering what's right, even if it takes time. After the war ended in 1945, the world began to change. Segregation in the military slowly crumbled. In 1948, President Harry S. Truman signed Executive Order 9981, desegregating the U.S. Armed Forces. Many historians say the seeds of that decision were planted by stories like Dory's, proof that bravery and sacrifice had no color line. Years later, when Pearl Harbor was rebuilt into a memorial, some survivors still remembered that day not just for the ships that burned, but for the men who stood and fought. One of them, a gunner's mate, told a reporter, "When the bombs fell, it wasn't about rank or color. You just looked for someone who wouldn't run. Dory didn't run." In time, he became part of America's collective memory of the war, not just as a sailor, but as a symbol. His story was told in classrooms, in documentaries, in military academies. Generations of young sailors would learn his name and understand that heroism doesn't come from training, it comes from heart. Yet for decades, his story was still told in fragments. Textbooks barely mentioned him. His medal count remained unchanged. The full measure of what he represented, a challenge to the prejudice of his era, was often left between the lines. But every so often, he would return to the public spotlight. In 1973, the U.S. Navy commissioned the USS Miller, FF-1091, a frigate named in his honor. It was the first warship ever named after an African-American enlisted sailor. When it was launched, Dory's surviving family members stood on the pier, tears in their eyes, watching a ship bear his name into the ocean he had once died in. Even then, his legend wasn't complete. There were still veterans, historians, and activists who said his courage had been undervalued. They kept pushing for a full recognition, for the highest honor America could give. But that, too, would take time. Because Dory's story wasn't just about what happened at Pearl Harbor. It was about what happened after, about how a man's courage could change a nation's conscience. And though he never saw it, the world he left behind was already moving toward the dream he represented, one where every man could serve, and every act of bravery could be honored equally. The war had taken him, but it couldn't silence him. Not really. Because heroes like Doris Miller don't disappear into the ocean. They rise again, in the stories we tell, in the ships that bear their names, and in the nation they helped reshape. Years passed, and the memory of World War II began to settle into history. The soldiers and sailors who had fought across the Pacific came home, built families, and tried to rebuild their lives. America entered a new era, one filled with both promise and contradictions. The war had united the country, but peace revealed the divisions that had always been there. Yet, through all of it, the story of one man, the cook who became a legend, refused to fade. In the late 1940s and 1950s, when the United States was reshaping its identity as a global power, there was a quiet effort to remember those who had defined the war's moral heart. Memorials were built, books were written, and heroes were honored. Doris Miller's name began to reappear in speeches, in history journals, in classrooms where teachers told wide-eyed children about the man who had stood up to impossible odds. But still, his recognition remained incomplete. The Navy Cross he had received was prestigious, but many felt it was not enough. The question lingered in veterans' halls and community centers: why not the Medal of Honor? In those days, the answer was rarely said aloud, but everyone knew. It wasn't about what he did, it was about who he was. America in 1942 hadn't yet been ready to put a black man's name next to its highest award for valor. Still, the generations that came after him kept that fight alive. Civil rights activists, veterans, and historians began to speak more boldly about the injustices that men like Dory faced. Men who fought for freedom abroad while being denied it at home. In the 1960s, as the civil rights movement exploded across the country, his name began appearing again in headlines and marches. There were signs and chants that read, "Remember Dory Miller, a hero denied." For young black Americans of that era, his story wasn't just a page from history, it was proof. Proof that courage, loyalty, and patriotism were not limited by color. That even in the face of a system built to hold him back, Dory had stood tall, done his duty, and become something larger than life. In 1973, when the USS Miller, FF-1091, was commissioned, it was more than just a ship. It was a statement, a long overdue acknowledgement from the same institution that had once refused to see him as more than a cook. The ceremony drew veterans, politicians, and Dory's family. His younger relatives stood there, watching a ship slide into the ocean with his name painted across its hull, and for a moment it felt like history had come full circle. But even then, the world still hadn't said everything it needed to say. Over the decades that followed, Dory Miller's name continued to echo quietly, through documentaries, books, and songs. The Navy used his story in recruitment films, and school children wrote essays about him every Black History Month. But among historians and veterans, there was still unfinished business. Because as time went on, more facts emerged. It turned out that several white sailors who had performed similar acts of bravery at Pearl Harbor had received the Medal of Honor. Dory had not. The contrast was impossible to ignore. In the 1990s and early 2000s, the campaign to upgrade his award reignited. Lawmakers in Congress began introducing resolutions urging the Navy and the President to reconsider. Veterans groups sent letters. Newspapers ran editorials. They all asked the same thing. After 60 years, could America finally give Dory Miller the honor he earned on that December morning? But bureaucratic walls are hard to break. Each attempt was met with the same response. The evidence was inconclusive, the records insufficient. The Medal of Honor, they said, required witnesses, clear documentation, specific procedures. And so, once again, Dory's courage remained trapped between legend and official record. Yet even without that medal, his impact deepened. The Navy itself began to change in ways he could never have imagined. Black officers rose through the ranks. Integrated crews became the norm. The once segregated service had transformed into one of the most diverse institutions in the country. And as the decades rolled on, America's understanding of heroism evolved too. It wasn't just about medals or ranks anymore. It was about meaning. It was about what a man's story said about who we are. By the 2010s, 70 years after Pearl Harbor, new generations were rediscovering Doris Miller through documentaries and social media. His name began trending again, proof that even in a world obsessed with the new, some stories never grow old. Then, in January 2020, something extraordinary happened. At a ceremony in Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy made an announcement that rippled across the world. For the first time in American history, a U.S. Navy aircraft carrier, one of the most powerful war machines ever built, would be named after an African-American enlisted sailor. Its name? USS Doris Miller, CVN 81. It would be the first carrier of its kind, not after an admiral or a president, but after a man who had started as a cook. A man who had picked up a machine gun when no one expected him to and changed history with his courage. At the announcement, Admiral John Richardson, then Chief of Naval Operations, said, "Doris Miller stood for everything that is good about our Navy. His story shows that heroism is not a matter of position, it's a matter of character." As the crowd stood applauding, the moment felt electric, almost redemptive. The descendants of Doris Miller were there, standing in the front row, tears in their eyes, as the Navy finally placed his name alongside the greatest symbols of American power. The ship itself, nuclear-powered, immense, and state-of-the-art, would not be completed for years. But its very existence was an answer to the question that had haunted his story for generations. Would America ever truly honor the man who had fought for her ideals before she was ready to live up to them? Now it had. The irony was beautiful. A black sailor once restricted to the mess hall would now have his name on a ship that could project freedom and power across the world. The cook who had no right to touch a gun was now etched into the steel of America's mightiest weapon. Even the ocean seemed to agree, as if history itself had waited for this moment. Today, Doris Miller's legacy reaches far beyond the war he fought in. His story has become a part of the nation's conscience, a reminder of what courage truly means. Not medals, not recognition, but doing what's right when no one expects you to. His name appears on schools, memorials, and Navy bases. His story is taught not just as a tale of war, but a testament to equality, to the idea that greatness can come from anywhere, from anyone. And every December 7th, when the bugles sound at Pearl Harbor and wreaths are cast into the sea, someone always mentions him. Sometimes it's a veteran who served under his name. Sometimes it's a child reciting his story in a classroom. But the message is always the same, that America's heroes don't always come from where you expect. If you listen closely on those mornings when the waves crash softly against the Arizona Memorial and the flags ripple in the Pacific breeze, you can almost hear the echo of that machine gun. The sound of defiance, of duty, of one man's courage standing against a storm. He was a mess attendant with zero gunnery training. When the attack began, he grabbed a .50 cal and shot down 4 planes. The Navy waited 6 months to tell his story. But history waited even longer, until the world was finally ready to understand what that story meant. Because in the end, Doris Miller didn't just defend a ship. He defended an idea. The idea that every man, no matter his station or his skin, can rise to meet history when the moment calls. And though the sea took him, and time almost forgot him, the truth survived. It lives on in the roar of engines that carry his name, in the flag that flies above them, and in every heart that still believes courage has no color. The waves of Pearl Harbor are calm now. The ships that burned that day are silent. But somewhere beneath the quiet water lies the spirit of a man who changed the course of history, not with a title or a uniform, but with sheer, unstoppable courage. And that, in the truest sense, is what makes Doris Miller not just a sailor, not just a hero, but a legend.